Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I'm glad to be able to offer remarks on my Bloc colleagues' motion today. Conservatives were not able to put any words on the record, unfortunately, last week, although certainly Mr. Noor Mohammed, I was quite impressed. He could talk for 2 solid hours last Thursday. That was by all parliamentary accounts, quite impressive. So well done, but certainly that limited our ability to weigh in on this and to ask experts further questions. I was actually quite hoping to ask them a number of things, but hopefully we'll have the opportunity again. Certainly I appreciate Ms. Michaud trying to find a pathway forward here. And just to address some of the things she said, again, I appreciate her efforts here. Of course, in the last committee meeting when she did put forward her first effort to do that, my main issue with that was that we would have had to have gone in camera, which means in secret, beyond the public's ability to view what we would have done, Mr. Chair. So that means ultimately we would have come out of a secret meeting with a plan forward of something that impacts 2.3 million gun owners. And I just don't think that that's the best approach. So I'm very glad we have an opportunity today to speak about this in public. I would have appreciated the opportunity to review the letter. There is a possibility we may have signed on to it as a Conservative team as well. We're certainly not opposed to more witnesses. In fact, what we would like to see is considerable consultation being put on this historic long gun ban that impacts hundreds, if not thousands of models of commonly used hunting rifles. And so I think something that's really important for the committee to remember, the only consultation that the Liberal government can currently point to in this regard is from 2018 when they went to Toronto, Vancouver, Montreal, and Fredericton, which are all phenomenal cities with phenomenal Canadians in them. However, I think you'd agree, Mr. Chair, there isn't a lot of farmers there. The density of hunters is likely not as high as, say, rural Quebec or rural Manitoba or Nunavut or the Northwest Territories. So I do feel that that main consultation they did on gun control falls very, very short of the rural and northern constituencies that should be represented at the table. And certainly it's been widely established both by the National Post, the CBC, CTV, that of course there are numerous commonly used long guns on this ban list that are used for hunting and as protection tools for livestock by farmers and the like. We could also talk about the conservation aspect of this. That's been widely recognized and established. There's countless examples of that. And in fact, the National Post today had an article called about a lot of misinformation from the government. They really break down the misinformation that I agree that with Mr. Noor Mohammed that there has been misinformation in this. And I do believe, though, a bit contrary to, I think, his point was that I think a lot of it is coming from the Liberal government who for weeks said that, no, this isn't a hunting rifle ban. This does not impact commonly used hunting rifles, which, of course, now we know, and of course, it does. The SKS is a perfect example of this. It's one of the most popular hunting rifles in Canada. It was used in the 1940s. And so we know that, of course, it's about 70, 80 years ago it was used as a military tool, and now it is commonly accepted as a hunting rifle. So I guess what they're trying to say is anything that's ever been used, perhaps even going back to muskets in the Civil War, should be banned in Canada. But I think a lot of hunters has been established. There are so many long guns that are so common. We're talking classic woodstock hunting rifles that are being used that will be banned by this. And I think that that's really the problem we're coming down to, and I don't necessarily see a path forward. The Prime Minister came out last week and said he will absolutely, and I'm paraphrasing, this is not his exact verbatim quote, but he will not be adjusting at all the definition of in the semi-automatic context. And that is one of the biggest problems. And something that the committee may have missed, to Mr. Noor Mohammed's credit, he asked this question. The analysts or the civil servants that were here made this very clear to his, good question, that the list that's about 300 pages long is firearms that fall under the OIC from May 2020, the ban criteria there. So 10,000 joules and a 20 millimeter bore diameter. That's what's in that 400 or 300 odd pages with several hundred firearms in there. That's what's in there. 480 of them are brand new. That's what's causing all the uproar. But what people don't understand, and what was confirmed in the last committee meeting, is that that list is actually going to be thousands of models of firearms long, because the semi-automatic definition that she confirmed, the bureaucrat from the last meeting confirmed that there is not a list that outlines how many firearms that is. That is not encompassed in the hundreds of pages that hunters have actually been able to see. So again, what what Canadians that are impacted by this don't even realize is that the firearms that are being banned, there's actually thousands of more models that will be banned. There's so many semi-automatic hunting rifles with magazine capabilities that don't meet the 10,000 joules and don't have the 20 centimeter or millimeter bore diameter. So those are countless more hunting rifles that we don't even have a list for that yet. I thought that was quite a shocking development. This list that's this big is likely going to be this big. And this is just really what we feel is the beginning. They're opening the door. And of course, a lot of the firearms on that list are lever action, brake action, bolt action. There's a number of those caught up in this. Obviously, classic hunting rifles as well. And so we just feel that the approach so far, there has been misinformation, but of course we feel that it's been the government leading on that. And even the gun control community has said that they're very disappointed with the government's communication on this. So what I would say when we're talking about the witness testimony in particular, while I appreciate the effort, I do feel that 2 meetings we might as well not even have meetings, because 2 meetings does not even cover the Indigenous communities that deserve to be at the table. Remember, we have Métis, First Nations, and Inuit, and we have various regional differences for various Indigenous culture, very different issues from region to region. So if we're going to even adequately represent the Indigenous communities, we would need more than 2 meetings, just those alone, let alone hunting and wildlife and angling associations, conservation associations, gun shops who have been absolutely hammered. This would be the 3rd gun ban they have to deal with in 2.5 years. And these are mom and pop shops for the most part. If you take Cabela's out of the mix, all of these are run by families, especially in rural and remote communities. So they have been absolutely hammered. We need them represented as well. Of course, gun ranges that are widely used by police in the areas as well. Those are privately owned. Those are being hammered by this. We also have heirloom collectors and World War II enthusiasts who collect memorabilia from the various world wars. We should have them at the table. We've also seen CBC coverage talking about the heirloom aspect of impacting Remembrance Day, because a number of the cannons and sort of, again, those antique kind of World War I and rifles will be, some of them will be banned under this. So, but of course, there's a lot of Remembrance Day ceremonies and other reenactments that happen in this country that are very important for remembrance purposes and honoring what Canadians, how much they sacrificed, what they experienced, to give Canadians a bit of an education of what that was like. And so they're being targeted by this as well. And so they should be at the table. So perhaps we should have various legions at the table, for example, or at least one. We also have the Northwest Territories, the Premier of the Northwest Territories, coming out and saying, if this passes, people will starve in her community, because they use legitimate tools that are being banned to feed their families. We have a Premier in this country saying, if this passes, people are going to starve in the North. She should absolutely be here. So should other First Nations communities or Inuit communities in the North as well. We have Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta, the governments there that are expressing great dismay about this. Perhaps we should have folks from their various levels of government come out. I think I mentioned conservation as well. What is the impact on those with hunting licenses and other licensing fees? What is the decrease that's going to be in that regard? We know a lot of the conservation efforts in Canada are a result of those fees. So what impact is that going to have? We also know that rural and northern communities really depend in many parts, especially Indigenous communities. Often they'll be guides for hunters, and often they're American hunters. So we have a hunting tourism in this country, particularly from the Americans, who will often bring semi-automatic rifles that will be banned now. So maybe the Americans who pay tens of thousands of dollars to come here, enriching local northern and rural communities, Indigenous guides, what's going to happen to that source of income? Are there Americans who are going to say, you know, this is just, the 3rd ban, like, we're just not going to bother? So what's that going to mean for areas like Timmins, Ontario, and other communities, and northern Manitoba, where there's fly-in prime hunting lodges and outfitters that really provide a sense of ability to have resources and economies in areas where there isn't booming in other industries. So I've just outlined a few, Mr. Chair, and they're certainly not exhaustive, but the idea that we can fit in even just half of what I just mentioned in 2 meetings, I mean, it's just impossible. And what's really frustrating for us as Conservatives is this work should have been done by the Liberal government and their vast resources. But now the committee, as you know, Mr. Chair, this is now our 4th week talking about this. We're going to have to go back, sort of flip-flop through this backwards in this committee process because they didn't do their homework, and now they're sort of turning it around and saying, well, okay, we'll do it in 2 meetings. So we have 2 meetings. We barely scratched the surface of the people that are impacted by this ban. Again, the largest hunting rifle ban in Canadian history here. We've barely scratched the surface. For people who don't know, 2 meetings, as you know, Mr. Chair, is about 12 witnesses. 12 witnesses. 12 witnesses. I don't think that that's nearly enough. So we just feel that any suggestion that 2 meetings is adequate I'm going to say it. I do feel that it's offensive to the people that are going to be impacted by this. It does not give them the dignity of having a seat at the table. And like I said, it does not even represent the Indigenous communities that need to be at the table, let alone everybody else. So we could not and we will not support 2 meetings under any circumstance. Now, recognizing that as many meetings as Conservatives would want would not be supported likely by all parties, I would say 50 would be adequate, given that that's the consultation that should have been done across the country, that they should have gone to Nunavut, they should have gone to the Northwest Territories, Northern BC, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Would love to see them go to Churchill. So I'm going to propose a bit of a solution to this, and perhaps it'll open up a bit of the discussion. And again, one of the last points I'll make before I do that is something I mentioned in I believe it was our first committee meeting when the Liberals pulled this amendment. It was about the utility of semi-automatics, and we've actually seen a number of people come forward who are saying the same thing that I am. So it's not just me, Mr. Chair. Actually, the NDP, I'll give her so much credit for the NDP for Nunavut in question period talked about the polar bear threat in Nunavut, pardon me, and how the ban will impact people's safety against polar bears in Nunavut. And that was something that I raised first off in this discussion that has not been widely recognized. Actually, just recently, somebody sent me, remember I talked about those wild boars, which I don't know if other committee members were aware of other parties, but I was just sent a video of a massive, there was about 30-odd wild boars that attacked a group of hunters. And again, very fast. They have tusks. They can be very deadly, and they do an all-out assault, and these hunters are running for their literal lives away from these wild boars. So again, I just feel that we need to have expert testimony to explain the raw utility of having a semi-automatic hunting rifle, because there is one, Mr. Chair. I know this. I know hunters know this. I know farmers know this, and certainly Northern Canadians are aware of this. So I don't mean to go on and on, but I just have so much to say, and we weren't allowed to talk in the last week. So, but I will wrap it up. I will move a sub-amendment here, Mr. Chair. And actually, before I do, I did want to mention, I should have done this off the top, my apologies, but I've been thinking a lot about Jim Carr, and we had a really great, really it was almost a year we got with him as the chair, and it was when I first came on as vice chair here, he was the chair, and it was his first time chairing, and he did a really phenomenal job. And I do have to say, it was actually nice to come to work and be on this committee. We worked together, I think, for probably the first time on public safety. We were able to all sign on to a guns and gangs study, pretty unheard of for all parties to agree to policy on guns and gangs. We also did an IMVE study, and we all came together on those. There was no dissenting reports. I think that's pretty impressive, and I lend a lot of that to Jim. Mr. Chair, I know that you'll do a phenomenal job as well. I have full confidence in you, but I am going to miss him a lot, and it's been a quite emotional 24 hours for all of us. So in that spirit, much like Mr. Noor Mohammed, I am trying to put forward a good faith amendment to this motion so we can open the discussion to something more reasonable. And just to underline, there is no way that we will agree to 2 meetings. It just will not do justice to this. So I'm going to put a proposal out there. People are welcome to counter-propose, but this is the proposal we're putting forward for discussion. And within this amendment, Mr. Chair, a lot of it, when we were writing this, we thought about the rural and northern Canadians that need to be represented at the table, and also how this committee has never traveled in the year that I've been chair of it. So why not take this opportunity and do the homework the Liberal government should have done? And so I hope that we can come together on this and meet in the middle. So I would move, and again, I don't have the amendment in front of me, Mr. Chair, so I don't know where exactly this would be placed, but likely where it starts at 2 meetings, and it would say...
The amendment has been distributed, I believe, by email.
Okay, thank you very much. So right after, I'm looking at it now. So right after 2 meetings here, where does it say that? Rural North, yeah. So we would say that the committee temporarily suspends the clause-by-clause study of Bill C-21 and that it allocate 20 consecutive meetings to study the effects of the amendments G4 and G46, and that these meetings include committee travel across Canada as soon as possible to rural and northern and Indigenous communities to hear from impacted individuals. That the committee, and then there's another small amendment in this amendment, so I'll just keep reading, that the committee invite to testify the witnesses and experts that it deem necessary to hear in order to answer the questions raised by new concepts and amendment by G4, and that the committee proceed accordingly to the usual routine rules for the invitations of the selected witnesses. That committee completion of the testimony, the Minister of Public Safety appear for 4 hours before the committee resumes in clause-by-clause consideration where it has been suspended, and proceed according to the usual rules pursuant to Standing Order 75 of the House of Commons. So just in sum, we're saying let's do 20 meetings, and let's ensure some of those meetings, if not all of them, involve rural and northern travel, including Indigenous communities. And at the end of all that testimony, we bring back the Minister of Public Safety for 4 hours to answer our questions. So that is my amendment. Thought that we can discuss it now as a committee and see if we can come together on this, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
That's a massive amendment. Do you have that in writing in both languages at this point?
So it's not actually that big, but
It seemed like a lot longer than 2
I
seconds.
reread the whole motion.
Okay, so you're changing, you're amending the number of meetings to 10,
20.
20, sorry, and you're adding the
Committee travel
committee travel, and you're adding
to rural and remote, or rural and northern, including Indigenous,
okay, and
the minister at
and
the
the
end.
minister at the end.
Yeah.
Okay, so the discussion continues on the amendment, and we go to Mr. Lloyd, followed by Mr. McGregor.
So I believe we're now discussing the sub-amendment proposed by
Amendment. It could
Ms.
be
Dancho?
sub-amended,
It
but
wasn't amended.
it's an amendment
It's to a motion.
to the motion that Madame Michaud
Oh, I
has
see.
given. It's complicated.
Yes, thank you.
I have a
You know,
map here.
I haven't been at the committee for a few meetings, but I've been watching very closely the evidence that's been put forward, and I want to thank my colleague, Ms. Michaud, Madame Michaud, for bringing forward this amendment and showing a desire to have additional witnesses to look into this. You know, what I think is just a massive amendment. You know, and I wish, you know, my Liberal colleagues would show some humility across the way when talking about misinformation and perhaps recognize that the whole reason that we're here today is because of an amendment that they put forward that does indeed have massive implications in this country. But moving forward, I think that this amendment put forward by my colleague, Ms. Dancho, is well placed because I remember back to earlier on during C-21 testimony, we had Indigenous witnesses come to this committee, and they were very clear that they had not been consulted and they did not feel consulted about this legislation. And it kind of disappointed me that we moved into clause by clause without taking a step back to recognize that, you know, these are Indigenous people in this country who have been disenfranchised by this country for centuries, for over a century. And they're telling us at committee that they were not consulted. Like these are representatives of First Nations and Indigenous communities. And this committee basically, you know, took down their testimony and said, well, we're going to move along. And that didn't sit right with me at the time. And, you know, I didn't know if I was going to have an opportunity to raise this issue, but I think now is a good opportunity to raise this issue because when we spoke to those witnesses, they said it's not good enough just to talk to the chiefs, because it was noted that, you know, one of the Liberal members said, well, we spoke to a chief about this and they said that they thought it was all right. You know, that's a big mistake because we really need to get into the grassroots with Indigenous communities, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. And we also need to approach them on their level. And I'm not saying limited to those groups because I think there's lots of other groups that we need to hear from on this specific amendment, but just speaking about the Indigenous witnesses for a moment, it's quite a thing to ask that people come to Ottawa from these rural and remote communities and northern communities. You know, a lot of times I know there is, you know, financial compensation for people to come here, but it's just not feasible for them. And we also know that in this country we still don't have a very strong network of rural broadband. Which also eliminates, and this leads to the question of capacity. Where there is no capacity, I don't believe there can be consent. And so I think it would really be essential for this committee, as a sign of reconciliation and good faith, to actually set aside some meetings for this committee to actually go into these communities, within reason. We're talking about Whitehorse, Yellowknife, Iqaluit, Churchill, northern Saskatchewan, northern Alberta, Vancouver Island, Labrador, just to name a few places. And maybe not all of those places, but certainly some of those places, they all have merit. It's important for us to go into these communities and invite these people within their own communities to come to our committee, to have their say and to be heard by us. And I think that would be a tremendous show of reconciliation in this country. I think it'd be a tremendous show of willingness to consult with First Nations and people who live in rural Inuit and Métis and folks that live in rural areas who hunt and trap for sustenance or for recreation. And so I really want to lend further support to my colleague's amendment here, and suggest that I think there's room for flexibility if members have specific places that they'd like to go to, or if there's a specific number of meetings that members think are appropriate. But I think setting out 20 as an initial proposal is a strong proposal, and I would hope that these amendments are taken in a good spirit by this committee. Thank you.